And we are live, Barb.
Hi, everybody. I'm Barb Flynn, one of the co-editors of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Along with the other co-editors, Mark Pagel and Dave Cantor, I'd like to welcome you to Managing...
Barb.
Hi, I'm Barb Flynn, one of the co-editors of the Journal of Supply Chain Management. Along with the other co-editors, Mark Pagel and Dave Cantor, I'd like to welcome you to Managing Supply Chains Beyond COVID-19, preparing for the next global mega disruption. Last March, the business and consumer communities became painfully aware of what all of us have known for many years, the vital importance of supply chain management. At the Journal of Supply Chain Management, we recognize the critical role of supply chains globally in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and important emerging research issues. We debated about the appropriate venue for supporting supply chain research related to COVID-19 in a timely manner without the normal delays associated with the publication process. About the same time, Kevin Dooley and Arash Azagadan approached us with the idea of inviting global supply chain experts to write essays on the COVID-19 supply chain topics of their choice. From this marriage of ideas came the birth of the upcoming issue of the Journal of Supply Chain Management, which we're proud to be publishing in just a few months in January 2021. Kevin and Arash have invited a wonderful panel of global experts on a variety of supply chain related topics, asking only that they focus on how the COVID-19 experience can help prepare supply chains for the next global mega disruption, whatever that may be. So the purpose of this webinar is to give you a sneak peek at their essays. During the next hour, the authors of each essay will provide a 5-minute overview of their thoughts. This will be followed by a 30-minute panel discussion. Please use the chat function to submit your questions and comments for the panel discussion. This webinar will be recorded, and you can find the link to the recording at the Journal of Supply Chain Management website, which I'll share with you at the end of the webinar. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Kevin Dooley, who will introduce our first 2 essays. Kevin?
Thanks so much, Barb and JSCM team and the authors that we have here on today, and now it looks like over 100 participants. So thank you so much for showing up. We're first going to hear from Dr. Mohan Sodhi, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management in the Cass Business School at the City University of London. He and his co-author, Chris Tang, UCL Distinguished Professor and Edward W. Carter Chair in Business Administration at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA, have penned the essay, Supply Chain Management for Extreme Conditions, Research Opportunities. So we'll hand it over to you, Mohan.
So can I share my screen? Yeah.
You should be able to. There should be, you should be able to see the share screen button at your bottom panel.
Yeah. So Chris and I wrote this essay for JSCM. So thank you very much for inviting for this essay, because it gave plenty to think about, because we've written a lot about supply chain risk. And so one of the first things is, okay, is this anything different from supply chain risk? And in fact, me and another co-author are taking the view it's the same as supply chain risk. And so some of the techniques we know for supply chain risk should work here. But upon more reflection, it is quite different. And I'll mention that I've made it with this picture, that when you have on the x-axis, you have changes in supply, and on the y-axis, you have changes in demand. And so when changes, there are small fluctuations, they match up, we call it supply chain management. When the fluctuations are larger, either on the supply side or demand side, we call it supply chain risk. That means a few companies are disrupted, or even many companies are disrupted, but for a short period of time. So that leaves room for what we call as extreme conditions. And those extreme conditions is where, in a way, if you push a chair, eventually it comes back. We call it resilience and a nice supply chain. But here you've destroyed the whole furniture or the whole china shop. And maybe I shouldn't use that metaphor. You have extreme changes either in supply or in demand, or in this case, both. So the examples Chris and I cite in the paper about ventilators and how that was handled, that's an example where you have a supply constrained, but at the same time, demand has shot up through the ceiling. And so you have an extreme condition, and it could happen the other way in agriculture countries. You can have gluts of supply, and the difference between supply chain risk and extreme supply chain is the impact on society. It's not just an impact on a few companies, but impact on society. So I think this requires much more. So just I was thinking maybe we should present it as 3 stages: small fluctuation, supply chain management, then big disruptions, but for temporary periods of time and affecting only a few companies, supply chain disruption or supply chain risk, and then some things that affect huge number of companies and affect society at large. So maybe 2008, 2009 financial crisis would also qualify, as does COVID-19. That would be extreme. So just a couple of more minutes. It also made me reflect when we talk about the other extreme, which is regular supply chain management, what we take for granted. And this is a list from the paper. We assume demand is more or less certain. We assume the channels are more or less stable. It's not suddenly, as we saw in COVID, stuff moves from one channel to another. You're selling toilet paper to offices, now you're selling it to homes. So complete change. Availability of labor, having visibility of the supply chain. These are assumptions that we assume in normal supply chain management. We assume the world is stable, and then permanent nature of supply chains. This, Gyeonggi already knows that many supply chains in humanitarian are temporary. They are project supply chains. But this is the first time we are seeing with COVID that even normal supply chains, even a toilet paper supply chain or food pickup from the curb, all that, many supply chains have been formed intended to be temporary. And of course, financial supply chain. So to sum up, we've listed some research opportunities. And I think one of the feedback we got from Barbara was, are we really closing the loop back to the original question? Maybe these research opportunities are very modest in comparison to the challenges we are facing. But at least looking at, from a society's point of view, small retailers competing with on Amazon. Earlier, this question was there before, but now it's far more compelling from an entire society's point of view, rather than one company trying to compete with one small company trying to compete with Amazon. The question of automation versus human, this was already there before COVID, but now the urgency is that you have to use automation because of social distancing and so on. And in Japan, for example, I read that number of robots have increased dramatically, but so not because it's cost effective, but simply because you want to distance, you want to have fewer people. But again, that has more compelling social implications than we had before. And then companies and government, I think we haven't really paid too much attention. There is a myth that somehow companies compete with each other and they are honest to the government. We already knew Google, Apple, and all that, they don't pay taxes. But regardless of that, now we are finding that companies need government to survive, at least in the UK, big handouts to companies to survive, and not necessarily to people. So this relationship between companies for good and the bad, and whether companies can survive without the government. So that means there is this invisible player in the supply chain, which we hadn't considered before, and that is the government. And we need some clarity on that in our research. And finally, this is an idea which is quite old, the idea of industry commons, where the government and companies together create some common resource. The idea of commons in England is really, many villages have an area where anybody can graze their sheep. I mean, we don't have sheep now, but the idea is that it's a common land. So same way, if we have intellectual property that is in the commons, how to make a ventilator, how to make a PPE suit, then in times such as these, somebody could quickly get that information and create it without worrying about intellectual property or doing R&D. And in Germany, they do that quite a bit. And maybe Gyeonggi knows in Scandinavian countries also the idea of using universities to create common knowledge for industries is there. But that's not come up in the supply chain literature yet. We haven't incorporated that. So I'll stop here. And
all right, thank you so much, Mohan. That was wonderful. Next, we will hear from Dr. Christine Mary Harland, who is a professor in the School of Management at Politecnico Milano. Her essay is entitled Discontinuous WEFs, Weaving a More Interconnected Supply Chain Management Tapestry. Go for it, Mary, or Christine.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, strange title, Discontinuous WEFs, and the word that I want to concentrate on here is interconnected. And for some reason, it's not forwarding to my next slide. Got it. Okay, so really the center of my essay is about connectedness versus interconnectedness of supply chain management. And it struck me as we were looking at all of our community's response, the academic community of supply chain management, and the many special issues that were coming out, that there were different approaches. And I was reflecting that a lot of our community were focusing on firm-based supply chain management issues, dealing with connected firms in supply chains. And a lot of this response to COVID was particularly on risk and resilience, which clearly are central topics, as Mohan was just outlining. And I was also reading a lot about what was happening within the United Nations relating to COVID. And from one of their reports, I got this quote, which really started me thinking about the COVID-19 crisis really brings home the depth of our interconnectedness. And these thoughts caused me to pose some questions. So my essay is based on central questions, which is about groups of supply chain management researchers working fairly separately on risk resilience, some working on humanitarian aid, supply chain management, others working on public procurement and government response in supply chain. And I was also reflecting on who was doing the work relating to the crises of supply market capacities. So we saw many supply markets for personal protective equipment, ventilators, and now we're looking at supply market capacity for vaccines, vials that the vaccine doses are going to go into. And we're hitting the buffers of supply markets globally. And it caused me to reflect that where in our subjects, where in supply chain management, do we really look at supply markets? So in the field of purchasing and supply management, we often look more at supply relationships than we do at supply markets. And so what my essay is on really is weaving these separate seams, that each of these different groups seem to be weaving their own separate seams. And so far, as a community, we haven't really connected all of these to form an interconnected tapestry. So what I'm proposing in my essay, I've turned to systems thinking, and I'm proposing a multi-level framework for supply chain management to help me to think about where all of our research fits and maybe then look at some research gaps. So the framework, which I've been trying to populate in the essay, and it covers a couple of pages, so I can only give you the axes here on the slide. On one axis, we can see the focus of supply chain management researchers, and different groups of us are working, focusing on firms' response to the crisis, some looking at groups and industry group response, some looking at public procurement and government response, some looking at humanitarian aid, supply chain management. And I wanted to propose here that we might, as a community, form a new set of researchers focusing on interconnected supply chain management to bring together these different areas. And on the other axis of the framework that I've been working on then is the systems level. And the systems level that we can see in practice, that we've got responses of individual organizations, we've got responses of state governments, and we also have national responses in terms of government responses. We have international responses to COVID in terms of, for example, the EU collaborating. And then where are the global responses? So we can see the G20 a few months ago stated that they are going to work to prevent further supply chain disruption. So they are thinking about supply chains, and we wait to see then what the intentions are from G20. But it's actually, I think, in the UN where we're seeing a global response, certainly to the vaccine issue through Gavi Kovacs, which is the UN response about a global initiative for the supply of vaccines when they become available. And this has really caused me to think that one of the things that we could be considering as a community is the issue of global stewardship, which isn't really addressed that much within supply chain management. And so the UN is trying to take global stewardship regarding vaccines. It's also tried, there's a less known initiative that they launched, which was called a control tower for other critical supplies. And it struck me that as a community, we could be researching and making a contribution on global stewardship relating to not just critical healthcare supplies, but also food supplies. But then for other crises beyond COVID, then water or critical aspects of dislocated populations, etc. So my overall suggestion is that we try then to think about where our research populates this framework and how we might work together to do something on this issue of interconnected supply chain management. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm going to hand it over to my friend Arash Azadigan, who's going to introduce the two next essays.
You're on mute, Arash.
Always the case, right? Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for the Journal of Supply Chain Management and the editors of the journal for the opportunity to provide this timely and hopefully helpful group of essays that should hopefully provide some direction to all of us in terms of researchers. I have the privilege of introducing an essay by Professor Dave Ketchen of Auburn University, Harvard College of Business, and co-authored by Christopher Craighead of Haslam School of Business, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. The title of their essay is Toward a Theory of Supply Chain Entrepreneurial Embeddedness in Disrupted and in Normal States. So Dave, go ahead, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the opportunity to provide one of these essays and for the opportunity to speak with you today. So real quick, if we were to stop 100 people on the street and give them this quiz, what organization invented each of the following, probably 99 of them would say McDonald's. But the actual answer is that each of these very famous products was created by a McDonald's franchisee, an independent company that is strongly affiliated with McDonald's. So, for example, the fillet of fish was invented by a guy in Cincinnati who was trying to appeal to Catholic customers on Fridays, because at the time it was very much a tradition for Catholics to not eat meat on Fridays. Simultaneous with that, McDonald's was actually trying to solve this problem, and they had created a pineapple sandwich, which I think we can all agree would have been a disaster. But they quickly latched onto this notion of fillet of fish as a way to serve a particular market on a particular day of the week. This is going somewhere, I promise. So, as Chris and I thought about putting this essay together, we were thinking about the adjustments that big companies have had to make due to COVID-19. And in many cases, they have done things like reducing SKUs. Coca-Cola just announced that they were cutting 200 product lines, for example. But beyond that simplification, are there some ways that large firms can benefit from entrepreneurial thinking in their supply chains, much like McDonald's has benefited from their franchisees? And if you think about it, franchisees are basically the tail end of the supply chain for McDonald's. So what we did was come up with this concept of supply chain entrepreneurial embeddedness. We've defined it like this: the degree to which small entrepreneurial business capabilities are integrated within a large firm's supply chain. And we've suggested that this phenomenon is valuable under normal conditions, but its value increases dramatically under duress. And in the paper, we use the example of hand sanitizer, where the big players like Amazon and Walmart, they had a really hard time sourcing hand sanitizer for several months. Meanwhile, you had distilleries all around the world who very quickly shifted from producing whiskey to producing hand sanitizer. And so our thought was, maybe large firms can figure out ways to incorporate these capabilities from small businesses into their supply chain organization in order to better prosper under difficult times. So we talk about 3 different ways of building this supply chain entrepreneurial embeddedness. One is buying up smaller companies, acquiring. One is allying with those smaller companies. And here we would see very strong, in-depth, deep engagement, much like a McDonald's has with its franchisees, not a simple strategic alliance like we're all familiar with. And then in terms of assimilating, we're thinking about actually just mimicking what small companies are doing. Maybe you do that through hiring away key personnel. Maybe you just study what they're doing and try to make it your own. We also go through a couple of moderator variables. One is we're suggesting that this phenomenon, the closer it exists to the end user, the more beneficial it's going to be to performance. And also the more that the service component of an offering is central to that offering as opposed to the product part, that will enhance firm performance as well. And so I have 20 seconds left and I'm going to end early.
Thank you so much, Dave and Chris, for the summary. Our next essay is by Gyöngy Kovács of Hanken School of Economics. And I hope I pronounced the name right, Iona Palagra Sigala. also from Hanken School of Economics. The title of the essay is Lessons from Humanitarian Logistics in Managing Supply Chain Disruptions.
Saraj. Jan and I are both working at a place called the Humlock Institute, apart from, which is a very specific place within the Hanken School of Economics as well. It's a joint institute between us and the National Defense University in Finland that focuses on humanitarian logistics and supply chain research. So perhaps less surprisingly, we are working with lessons that we can learn from humanitarian logistics to manage supply chain disruptions, especially now COVID-19. On that, why do we work with humanitarian logistics and why do we want to learn from that in this particular area? You may consider humanitarian logistics mostly in literature when you see it with regards to natural disasters. That's what probably the biggest bulk of literature is on in this area, even though in fact conflict zones would take the bulk of actual activity. But then also humanitarian logistics responds to pandemics and epidemics as well. So I tend to, whenever I'm talking about this, check out the latest disaster maps, whatever is being monitored. Currently, there are not that many other huge ones out there in the world apart from COVID-19, but there are measles outbreaks, polio outbreaks, and in the past, you've had anything from SARS and MERS to Ebola, Zika. Cholera is a usual one and a frequent one, also coming back in cycles and so forth. Another thing that one can always learn from humanitarian logistics is just this whole background of, just as in healthcare, the first principle is first, do no harm. So the Hippocratic Oath applies to this discipline as well. And that is a really important one because it also means that before delivering aid, before doing any activity, the first question is, what is it that people really need? What is it that really helps them and what alleviates suffering? And it's not always the wanting to do good that is necessarily the best option from the actual beneficiary's perspective of whoever needs to get out of their situation and improve their livelihood. But that's quite an important aspect of humanitarian logistics as well. We focused in this paper with Joanna on the actual lessons learned. So when you're looking through humanitarian logistics literature, there's quite a lot that is already being discussed on what can be done for any kinds of bigger disruptions, and that includes, for example, COVID-19. And if you want to hear a lot more, of course, there's a specialized journal in it as well, the Journal of Humanitarian Logistics and Supply Chain Management. But here we tried to just really nail it down to certain areas that are going to be of essence for this particular pandemic, but also apart from this pandemic for any kinds of other major supply chain disruptions. Because in fact, when we are looking at the bigger disruptions out there, I mean, climate change would be another big one to prepare for, and really to reconsider all of the ways that we are operating because of that. So these 5 main pillars are the following. One is preparedness, and there we looked at literature saying that usually one discusses preparedness, stock and pre-positioned inventory under preparedness the most, but there is a lot more to it. In fact, there is mitigative preparedness versus curative preparedness. So if you dig down in the literature, there, you will find a lot more in terms of like, when do you prepare, how do you prepare, what all is included. Perhaps one of the biggest issues here is even just the training of staff and having rosters of people who know what to do in a disaster. And then of course there are forecasts, including, for example, climate forecasts, where you look at how are disaster patterns going to change, not just what's the next meteorological forecast. So from that, you can also prepare differently for the next kind of bigger events. And in fact, there are pandemic forecasts the same way, and there were pandemic forecasts saying that we are expecting a global pandemic at some point. So that's not in that sense news. Then there are other things in procurement, like framework contracts, capacity reservation systems. I like what Christine said also about we can learn a lot from one another, because the same systems that work for Zara work in the humanitarian supply chain just as well. And there is a lot to that. Then other pillars we recognized here. One is how to speed up and how to mobilize. There are speculation strategies, there are postponement strategies, of course. Maybe some things that are not that typical in other supply chains are these forecast-based early actions. Then you tend to look at, for example, meteorological forecasts, pandemic forecasts, earthquake forecasts, and seismological forecasts, and start to deploy already. There have been things like quake jumpers after earthquakes. There have been people pre-deployed into hurricane zones so that as to speed up needs assessment. There is a lot you can do in these kinds of things. Let me just quickly highlight the other three as well. Standardize is a big issue where we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic particularly is how humanitarian organizations have been thinking about medical aid as kits. Recognizing interdependencies of items and the needs for one another before deploying something. Also pre-packaging groups of items like that. It's been a big issue in the current medical response, where, for example, test swabs were suddenly not available, or reagents were not available in labs to run tests, even though we know that certain other items and materials will also be needed. In standardization, what the humanitarian space has done, especially in the medical area, is something called developing interoperability measures. Kits is one part of it, but of course the processes is another. So to make sure that if one organization delivers to another, the other organization would also know what to find where and how to use the items. That's quite an important aspect in it. Again, I want to just maybe come back to this global stewardship and interconnected supply chains that Christine has been saying here. Innovation is big. So Dave, definitely there is a lot to that. The biggest things here that we see in COVID-19 are, of course, production changeover, including in transportation, where we have had a big problem with especially air transportation not operating now in many areas, and a lot of medical aid going in belly cargo. So those kinds of planes have been put up as cargo planes is a big relief in that sense. There's, of course, a lot of other things. Maybe one of the biggest things for the future is systemic change. There is, in the humanitarian space, there's a movement away from what we call in-kind deliveries, as to say a movement away from delivering products and materials to, for example, delivering cash. And by that, shifting the whole idea to a more pool supply chain where beneficiaries themselves can decide what they want and what they need. Collaboration is an all-time topic. We couldn't highlight it more. Christine has probably done a much better job than I did now in this particular thing. One aspect in collaboration that is really important is that of framework agreements as well. Especially what is tricky, of course, in the humanitarian space is to have framework agreements with suppliers where actual purchase frequencies are really low, and yet you want suppliers to prioritize you. But nonetheless, these are things that you can work with, and these are definitely lessons to be learned from humanitarian logistics for managing the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to maybe also draw your attention to our project called Heroes. It's an EU project on COVID-19, amongst many topics of which is also supply chain management. We've had a results webinar 2 days ago. You will find the webinar, also the recording of that at Heroes Project EU. This is also, of course, this paper itself also comes out from that particular project, but you will find now a lot more details already on that website. That's as much as it is from me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gyeonggi Ayona, for your contribution. Just a reminder to the audience and, of course, the panelists. We are, with the help of Jackie, we are filtering questions. So at any time you have a question, feel free to drop it into the chat area. I know we've shared quite a bit of information here. So as fresh as it is, feel free to do that. And it'll be our job to kind of direct them as we go. I'll hand it over to Barb Flynn for the next step.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not sure, I seem to be sharing the wrong thing here. This has been so interesting. I think we've heard, many interesting perspectives on COVID-19 and supply chains. It struck me that we don't even have a good name for what this is. Supply chains under duress, extreme supply chain management, mega disruptions. We don't even know what to call it. And we've heard about, the government perspective, entrepreneurial perspective, humanitarian perspective. We're going to close with an essay by Arash and Kevin on the complex systems perspective, entitled Mesolevel Supply Network Resilience, Complex Collaboration in a Complex World. And again, Arash is at Rutgers Business School and Kevin is at Arizona State University. Once they're completed, they're going to facilitate a panel discussion. So please be entering your questions for both specific essayists as well as the entire panel, and we'll spend the rest of the time on that. So I'll turn this over to Arash and Kevin.
Great. Okay, let's see if we can do this. I hope I'm sharing the presentation mode. Is that correct, or do I need to swap?
We're seeing the two slide
Swap,
mode.
yeah.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Up.
Need to swap.
I do need to swap. Okay. Better now, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, as Barb kindly suggested, our topic is Mesolevel supply network resilience in a complex collaboration. The way that I can describe this, and thanks Kevin for letting me go first, is the sandwich model. I can't help to think that our essay is somehow, from a food standpoint, is related to Dave and Chris's, meaning that we discuss matters related to 3 layers: the bottom, the top, and the middle. Let's say the meat part of resilience. And so the Mesolevel obviously lands between what is considered micro level resilience and macro level resilience within networks or network of networks. Micro level resilience, we're all familiar with. It's a collaboration between buyers and suppliers, be it in the dyad or the supply network in a single entity. The most prominent example of that is the tight network that Toyota has. If anybody has read through some of the resilience work written about Toyota and how they were able to manage the brake failure and the recall related to their supplier Aisin Seiki a while back, you can see how the collaboration at that level was provided. More recently, the Takata airbag recalls required, be it BMW or other ones, to work through their supply chain and come up with ways to mitigate the disruption after it happened. Okay, so that's, let's say, the bottom bun of the sandwich that Dave suggested. Let's go to the top bun, and that is the macro level resilience. Much of what we see and what Gyeonggi talked about in terms of humanitarian response to disasters falls into this category. It's essentially a collaboration among many different entities across industries and government, right? So be it the current hurricane coming through, be it Sandy or Michael, excuse me for the typo there. There's FEMA, there's non-governmental organizations, retailers such as Walmart that got involved. And so, from a, this is of course in response to disruptions, from a prevention standpoint, we also have quite a number of macro level resilience activities. One is, if you remember, the US federal government, after the oil embargo, actually developed a strategic petroleum reserve just to make sure at that level, at the macro level, we have enough oil. And that's obviously with the collaboration with oil refiners and manufacturers. Another example that I don't have here is prominent here in New Jersey. We talk about it, and that is the stockpile for pharmaceuticals and vaccines. If you're not familiar, throughout the United States in secret locations, we have piles of medical equipment and medicine stockpile. And that is done with the collaboration between CDC and firms such as Johnson & Johnson and Merck and others. That's all fine and dandy, but for some reason, COVID was able to show how neither of these two buns, if you will, were able to really satisfy and enable us to truly respond to it. So what we're proposing is perhaps something in the middle here, and that's what we call a Mesolevel resilience. Examples that come close to Mesolevel resilience, and they're not perfect, but some of you might be familiar with the example of the resin shortage, Evonik plant in Germany that caught fire. And the resin was used in tubing for many auto manufacturers. And even though they thought that they were protected because of a multi-sourcing, fascinatingly enough, all of their suppliers were actually getting this resin from single source. 65% of the entire world's capacity of resin PA12 came from one little tiny plant in Germany. And so it was with the involvement of competitors such as Ford, General Motors, Toyota, Honda, and others through the leadership of AIAG that they were able to manage this particular disruption. Another one comes from compliance requirements by EU and ROHS to set strict rules in using hazardous substances such as lead in electronics equipment. So you can see how there is in Mesolevel resilience, it's just not one layer of the supply network that is involved, but a multitude of levels. And again, these examples are not even a perfect manifestation of what we would consider Mesolevel resilience. The essay talks about the need for Mesolevel resilience, which essentially, again, like I say, is collaboration across industry layers. But then from there, we add to the paper by suggesting when and where this Mesolevel resilience could be applied more. Fascinatingly enough, be it at the macro level, such as water, food, and shelter, those are the elements that the institution, the government, the national institutions are going to be very concerned about. And also from a population standpoint, there's going to be a response. Gyeonggi would hopefully agree with this, that when it comes to water, food, and shelter, we are going to provide support for that, as we saw with COVID and medical. But when it comes to other needs, the higher level of Maslow's hierarchy, such as self-actualization, status, freedom, and recognition, there is no a way to defend such. And so industries that are in those higher level hierarchies are bound to need some more support in terms of combining the different resources available. A second part of where Mesolevel resilience becomes important, we argue, is the role of small business. Why is that? So in other words, the percentage of small businesses in an industry implies that they just don't have the backup, the ability to buffer and be prepared for disruptions. And as a result, they will need support from others in the industry and across different industries. Again, when I say industry, it's not necessarily horizontal at one layer of the supply chain, but it could be upward. And obviously from a network standpoint, it includes competitors as well. Lastly, the industry type is likely to make a difference on the importance of Mesolevel resilience. And this comes from work from Zurich that suggests, Zurich Insurance, that should suggest that when it comes to disruptions, certain industry types are prone to see particular disruptions more frequently or longer recovery times. And so oil, gas, automotive, fascinatingly, get more frequent disruptions, perhaps because of the complex nature of their supply network, and electronics and aerospace with longest recovery times. I honestly don't have a good answer as to why electronics and aerospace take longer to recover, but the evidence is there, and therefore those type of industries are likely better to look into meso-level resilience. And then I will just put our summary table here, although not necessarily a need to go through all of it, but I'll leave it to Kevin if he likes to add some comments about the differentiation between the three levels of resilience and how MESO from a supply network standpoint is necessary to consider.
No, I just make thank you, Raj. Just make a concluding statement that while all three of the supply network structures are complex adaptive systems, the Mesolevel perhaps at least conceptually best mimics what we think of as a complex adaptive system. And it fills that gap between essentially proprietary and institutional support systems. And I'll say, certainly as we kick off our questions here, that I think that all of us have the same mental model. We've used different language, and we've shown a flashlight on different parts of the elephant, so to say. But it was interesting to hear the commonality of if you go up 30,000 feet, the commonality of our presentations here. So Barb, how would we like to manage the Q&A here?
It looks like we've got a lot of questions in the chat function. So why don't you go ahead, Kevin, and have at it. Some of these are for specific essayists, and I believe some of them are for the entire panel. And I would say probably no more than about 15 or 20 minutes. Okay.
So, and can the panelists come off or not? Off of
the panelists should be able to unmute and participate. Those who didn't present can participate as well.
Okay. So we have a comment and a question observation here from Stephen Wagner. Stephen, would you like to jump on and kind of either pose as a brief comment?
I'm not sure that they can unmute. I think you'll just have to read the question. Yeah.
Okay.
Both practitioners. There are more above his as well. There are a lot of them.
Yes. Both practitioners and scholars all too often throw different types of supply chains and different customers in one pot. For example, missing ventilators and toilet paper, or drop in aircraft demand, sales and production, different goals, different problems, different customers. We as academics should be much clearer with respect to what we talk about. Impact of COVID on the economy, availability of supplies, ensuring supplier readiness, and a number of other points. So I think, can maybe one of the panelists talk to how we need to consider kind of the variety of contexts and industry sectors and scale here to be clear on how we're suggesting these concepts be applied.
I'll add a quick answer, and then maybe somebody else can add more to it. I used to work in consulting at Accenture, and I worked in the supply chain group, and all my clients were from different industries. And sometimes the same client I had to cut across different industries for. So in that sense, supply chain management, there is a huge core which is common to many industries. When you get very close to it, yeah, there are differences industry to industry. But supply chain management is a true horizontal cutting across many industries, both in my industry work and now last 20 years in academia.
Thanks, Mohan. We have a comment or question from Rob Glue, who wonders, with these temporary supply chains, can we learn things from our traditional supply chain management? So we've talked about primarily the other way. What's unique about these temporary supply chains?
Yeah, he had made that question to me. We're getting a kitchen maid in the background, so that's the sound. Sorry about that. A little project of my own. So when I studied linear programming and other things back as a student, all supply chains were kind of temporary. You made a plan for a particular period of time, and it wasn't. And because it was linear programming, exactly numerical answers, it was always temporary. Although the time would depend on the industry, 6 months or 6 years. But now that we've shifted a lot more to microeconomics, then the principles have become as if they were true for a stable world, just like economists talk about equilibrium. And I think that thinking is very much there in the supply chain field now. We think the world is more stable than what it is. I mean, humanitarian logistics brings in a lot more of that project management perspective. But in a way, we just have to go back. Or if we look at industry, people make plans. The consumer packaged industry, it's for a promotion. So the thinking is very much there in industry and in certain subfields within academia. But I think the presence or the overarching presence of microeconomics, at least in the analytical supply chain literature, means that we somehow think the world is in equilibrium. So it's our thinking that needs to change. But the world is a temporary place. Maybe Gyeonggi could mention more.
Yeah, I was wondering if I may add a couple of things on it, because you were right. I mean, there are lots of things in project industries in general that you find in this regard, and a lot of literature on project industries, such as even the construction industry, where it's usually temporary supply chains. You're talking about every single construction project has a different kind of configuration of which suppliers and which companies are involved. Yet, if you look at it over a longer period of time, it kind of comes and goes with the same groups of companies by and large. There's a lot more of literature on that, especially written by Marianne Jahre and a number of other people in the area of humanitarian logistics, because she's had a background in construction supply chains as well. So she looked at the aspects of temporality versus what is constant and what is not constant in humanitarian supply chains. What is probably also interesting is the resource configurations of them, because I remember many years ago, Peter Tatum and I were trying to compare military supply chains and humanitarian supply chains, because they both have to respond to large disruptions, if you think of it, very large scale disruptions, but their resource configurations are very, very different from one another. So I think there are different ways that we can deal with these kinds of problems, and different kinds of benchmarks we can use depending on industry as well.
We have a very interesting question around PPE. So the comment is that basically from their calculation, COVID caused about a 10% increase in hospital days from baseline. And the question is, how could only a 10% change in demand have led to such a severe shortage?
I might have a go at that as well, because I did start off an answer in the Q&A. I don't know if people actually can see it, but there are quite a lot of factors that you can look at. And in fact, here you can look at our HEROES project deliverables, because we do have comparative data from quite a number of different cases there. Factors include like which PPE you're talking about. It's not all of it is very standard at hospitals to begin with. We also knew from a very long time ago already that there's a global shortage of PPE, and now in a global pandemic, that's going to be a problem. In the US in particular, no offense, but local preparedness levels or the lack of them play a role. There are lots of other factors as well. 10% is a huge increase of a normal length if you think of it from a lean healthcare perspective. Maybe in terms of healthcare, I pass it over to Christine to respond to a little bit more of that though.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's also partly healthcare perspective, but also from a public procurement perspective as well. So one of the big issues that we found, which have caused some of the shortages way above, I think is a really good point to make, way above than might have been, is the lack of coordination, and the lack of coordination across those units that are procuring. And the healthcare systems in all countries are very complex. They're comprised, they're public and private. And so they have many ordering points, some of them in the private sector, some in the public sector. And the problem has occurred that it becomes a competition in between all of these different ordering units, to the extent that we've witnessed really quite bad behavior going on in terms of therefore overstocking, so one state benefiting at the expense of another state. But we've also seen countries, there are actually accusations of piracy of seemingly respectable countries actually sequestering goods legally purchased by other countries. So this level of competition and lack of coordination is what triggered me to be interested in the UN's proposal to say, in here, there are certain items, critical items. I think using Maslow's hierarchy of needs is something we've also latched onto as well, that we do need some more joined up thinking to be able to manage that. However, it does rely on collaboration and stewardship. So who is going to accept the responsibility and who is going to sign up for that? So at the moment, we've got these tensions of competition that's occurring in the procuring units. And that's one of the major causes of why we do have these shortages and why we've hit the buffers on so many of these supply markets.
Great. So I think this is one for Dave and Chris. Regarding the entrepreneurial capabilities of supply chains, what resources, capabilities, or roles do you think will be most crucial to establish in order to succeed with the innovations crafted during the pandemic? So I think this question is about how do we move forward with the innovations that we see today?
I'll take a stab at that. I think what you're going to see is that entrepreneurs are going to have to take a step back and do a little strategic thinking and say, okay, let's say I'm a small family restaurant and let's say I'm a higher end family restaurant. Historically, I've always avoided doing home delivery because I feel like it waters down my premium brand to do delivery. I want to bring people into my restaurant and have them enjoy the ambiance. Well, due to the shutdowns and the restrictions, I couldn't have people in my restaurant. And so I had to resort to these doing home delivery. As things loosen up and as I'm allowed to have more people in my restaurant, do I keep doing the home delivery because it's added some new revenue? How do I trade that off against the potential threat to my high-end reputation? I think every entrepreneur is going to have to do some strategic thinking about that and say, which way do I want to go here? But I'm not sure there's one cookie cutter answer for everybody. Everybody's going to have to answer that for themselves. Chris may have additional thoughts.
Just to add to look at the supply chain perspective, I think that if you do look at small entrepreneurial firms, they accelerate on a few dimensions: fast decision making, the ability to quick pivots. They tend to have very end-to-end supply chains because of the scale of the number of people working for them, and they tend to be very customer centric. And so I think you know, the idea behind this, you know, embedding this in the supply chain is those complement, you know, for example, large firms, scale and leverage. And we're certainly not advocating that we abandon all of that, but rather use entrepreneurial embeddedness as a complement to what we already do really well in large supply chains.
Thank you. And Barb, maybe should we take one more question?
Sure, I think one more would be fine.
All right. So maybe this is to Arash. We discussed 3 levels as though it is simple for these supply chains to work effectively. Major problem is that the macro level supply chain in the US is not simple at all and definitely not effective. How do you suggest that this complexity be improved, or what is recommended course of correction, since it is apparent that under crisis situations, supply chains become extremely complex?
Yeah, regarding the inefficiency of government institutions, be it in the United States or elsewhere, of course, we compare the US to other developed countries. Keep in mind that perhaps the next stage of COVID is going to be something that Gyeonggi and scholars that are working on humanitarian perhaps are going to be focused on more, and that is developing countries which don't really have the basis, institutional basis. So the short answer to that is what COVID has taught us is that we can't really rely on governmental institutions, be it at the federal level, at the state level, and otherwise. Those of us working in crisis management have seen that FEMA is advocating for self-reliance in terms of resilience. And that's essentially why we're suggesting that, yes, self-reliance is great, but self-reliance alongside our neighbors is better and much more responsive. And so it becomes from an operations management standpoint, which we're all essentially rooted in, it becomes a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down. It's a decentralized control, and but however, the decentralized control, just like complex adaptive systems, do have to raise up, and alongside with that, the fact of the matter is that the institutional responses are, again, for, I don't want to call it survival, but for basic needs. And fortunately, as the world develops and we see the modern life enhancing much of what we have been provided, I mean, obviously we wouldn't be able to meet like this a few years back, and the connectivities and lessening of price of food and other sundries in life have gone down as a result of that. But the upper side of our needs are something that perhaps are out of reach for governments to assure. And again, so it comes back to industries to take the lead on that.
Thank you, Arash. And I want to thank, on behalf of Arash, all of our wonderful co-authors or authors that are part of this project, and thank JSCM for this opportunity. And Barb, I'll hand it back to you to close out.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Oh, this has been wonderful. I think you know, we're dealing with all sorts of interesting perspectives on supply chains and the COVID crisis, and I hope that you found that this sneak peek at our upcoming essays provides you with some food for thought that you can use in your own research. I'd like to remind you again that the full essays will be available starting in January, or they'll be published in our January issue. And I'd like to encourage you all to submit your research on COVID and supply chains to Journal of Supply Chain Management. We aren't doing a special issue per se, but we welcome your submissions for our regular issues. We're certainly very interested in COVID. So I'd like to close by thanking Kevin and Arash for organizing this. This has been wonderful, and thank you to all of you who are attending. And again, the recording of the session is available on our website. So we hope you'll find this useful. Thanks, everybody.